speakers represent perspectives in how we use our voices to support or protest issues that affect our communities.
Over the last year, I think it's safe to say that Portland has seen its fair share of protest. And that some of that has been like deeply disruptive, right? And so I think that there's this this tension, right, between everyday life in a democracy like ours and the fundamental rights that we have to petition our government and the various forms that that right has, including taking to the streets and protest, right? That the framing fathers of the Constitution, right, the folks who thought about the Constitution and the First Amendment actually had in their mind just this kind of disruption. And so that tension, right, I think we can think of as a cost, right? And the question that I hope to posit, not answer, and I'm not sure that any of us could really meaningfully answer it, is whether we think collectively that cost is worth paying for, right? That the society that we live in, which allows us to take to the streets, but also means that we might be that person stuck in traffic or unable to like meet our daily obligations because of that cost, whether that's worth it. Because I think that what we'll see as the next few years unfold is a country that has to grapple with that cost. And maybe even more so than we've ever grappled with it before, as we see views polarizing. Something that I actually don't think is particularly healthy for a democracy, to become more and more polarized over time. But that hopefully there's a lot of good to be had out of what has happened over the last year. And that is that the amount of attention that people are paying to fundamental rights, including the First Amendment right to speech and the potential restriction on media, like a free press, is unlike anything we've seen, at least in a few decades, if not longer. And that is actually quite good for us, even if right now it's incredibly uncomfortable.
A few years ago, I read a book called The Opposable Mind by Roger Martin, and the takeaway for me in that book after reading it, he had done research on really what makes great leaders in business and in government, and the common theme that I thought was the most important out of the research was that great leaders aren't afraid of hearing opposing opinions. In fact, they welcome it. And I was fortunate to work with Mayor Katz, and she would always say that, said, I want to hear what's going on out there. I want to know if somebody's upset about something. I want to know what they think I should be doing and I'm not doing. I may not agree with it, but I want to know what it is. And I think it's pertinent here too that all of us, can benefit by hearing opposing viewpoints and thinking how that might change our own viewpoints. So,
I do love this topic because I spend most of my time, although I'm a lawyer, I spend most of my time now thinking about how Americans, particularly, can participate in decisions that affect their lives. And so whether that be public policy decisions or working with one another to make their communities a better place, even if it doesn't require a specific policy decision. And when we think about civility or incivility, that really affects our ability to do those things, right? And so I just want to be clear that I don't actually think either protest or conflict are inherently uncivil. But I do think that we're in a toxic soup of incivility that we need to really think about, and that there are tensions, like Matt said. And one of the ways that I think about the tensions is decades and decades and decades of public opinion research will tell us that Americans actually have a kind of bucket of values that they share, but how they prioritize them is where things start to break down. And if we're just going to be sort of like, make some gross generalizations about this question, the question of individual expression, and the question of connecting with others, most Americans share both of those values. But when you start to think about civility and incivility and how we speak to one another, how we rank those things in a particular moment affect our behavior and whether we're seen as civil or uncivil. And I have to say, I get a little jumpy about the idea of civility for its own sake, that's a value in and of itself. But the kind of sharpness and lack of listening and personal attacks are corrosive to our ability to work together as a populace. And I want to challenge us to think about whether that's accidental or whether, in fact, that kind of incivility is being fostered in our public discourse. By far, the huge motivator is outrage, and that people come into public settings because they're outraged over something. And as I was thinking about outrage over the last few months, I started looking at poker. And there's an expression in poker. Are any of you poker players? Do you know the expression tilt? That you try to drive your opponent into what they call tilt, which is so outraged and angry that they make bad decisions. And so you can manipulate people when they're in the state of tilt. And that really rang true for me, for how we are being manipulated by big systems to behave when we're really trying to interact with each other or decide where our town's going to go or decide where a stoplight's going to be. Not to mention things like healthcare policy and tax policy and all the other things that are going to affect us for generations to come. So I think about the fact that I think it's easy for us to become internally critical or critical of our individual neighbor, right, about their behavior, but to think that the systems are also generating a kind of incivility that then we step into and are kind of swept away by. The other thing I do want to point out is that the political systems, of course, love outraged behavior and encourage it. So it's not just the media and Facebook and all that stuff. So as we think about how we want to make decisions together, if we elevate those systems, of course, those are the systems that encourage us to be our honest to God worst. And there are plenty of places where we can design systems where we're actually asked to listen to one another, where we can put down the stick even for a half hour and make decisions.
What would you do if you were in control of Facebook to try to put on measures that could alleviate the problems that we've seen? If you had the ability to set some controls to eliminate hate material from Facebook, how would you go about doing that?
As I'm skeptical that a capital-driven corporation will ever come up with rules that fundamentally serve individuals, right? Because their goal isn't to protect us. Their goal is to serve ads. And my rage-filled post that Wendy just talked about, I bet serves more ads than like the really pleasant, constitutional conversation that's happening over on somebody else's page.
What are some specific tools that you are very familiar with that are used to help people with differing viewpoints and interests be able to hear each other and problem solve with each other?
And that's a lot of what we do is, I guess most importantly, it's creating a safe environment and having somebody help manage that space in an impartial way to give value to everyone's comments within the forum or the room or the group, and instill in people the ground rules before you start to make sure that somebody can say something without worrying about the repercussions from the others in the audience. So it's that, I don't know if it's a referee is the right word, but somebody that can maintain a safe environment for discourse amongst the entire group.
I think, Marge, too, I think there's 3 resources that people can use in their own lives without having to, hire a facilitator. And there's probably more than that, but 3 that I actually often recommend to people are, if you go to the websites for Living Room Conversations, who many of you may know, they have great sort of discussion guides on particular topics that are great. The National Issues Forum, which was funded by the Kettering Foundation, they've got really detailed discussion guides on everything from mass incarceration to education reform to opioid abuse. And then the other is Everyday Democracy. They work a lot on social justice and racial justice issues, and they've got great discussions on discussing issues of racial justice in particular. And they've got little videos and discussion guides, and they're, if you need them between now and next Thursday, you could go right home and download them.
At the beginning of every conversation, especially when you feel yourself like, that temperature rising in the back of your neck as someone is saying something like that just doesn't jive with you. Like that, to ask yourself, like, what is my vantage point, right? Like, how do I see this problem? And can I actually like identify that other person's vantage point? And even if I ultimately disagree with them, can I understand how they got there?
So I'm going to give each of you a chance to suggest to the audience the next steps that they can take to promote civil discourse. So this is kind of some advice to the crowd.
I think that the question that we often get, what do I do now? So I will tell you the 3 things that I always say, which is that you should find an organization that you align yourself with, and dedicate some of your resources, be it time or money, but preferably a little bit of both, to that organization, and just like really get into it. Because one of the things that I think, Wendy and basically all of us have talked about is that the extreme nature of the current events is divisive, and you could find yourself feeling isolated. So find your community and plug in, because I think actually the solution to a lot of the divisiveness is just like having conversations with each other, and like one of the best ways to do that is to find community. I will also say that for those of you, I imagine that everybody here does this, but do actually write and call your representatives. They really do listen to you, and they really especially listen if you write them a letter. Write it out, actually write it. Because that matters, and people just think that, I think that there's also this fear today, right, that we are so disenfranchised by Citizens United and other really impactful things that our voices no longer matter. And that's like another symptom, right, of isolation. And I think you can combat that by exercising your voice. And I think the third one is to rest and to take a break from it, and to turn off Twitter, which I never do. But
You never do Twitter, or you never turn it off?
Oh, I never turn it off. But really, your mind can't function at the rate of Twitter, right? It literally can't. You can't process that much information all the time. And with the stressors of everything that is happening, not to mention we all have normal lives that we live. If you don't actually take time to take care of yourself, I don't think will be an effective member of society.
I agree with everything Matt said, with the exception of turning off Twitter. But having the opportunity to work around the state of Oregon and look at this interdependence between urban and rural, or urban-rural divide as we often refer to it, I would suggest that everyone try to engage in a conversation with somebody that has a different opinion than you do. And you can start with the ones that aren't that difficult, just with other Oregonians that may have a difference on a land use issue, or you don't have to start with abortion. You can start with some of the easier topics and just try to get to understand what's behind that thinking and how to have a civil conversation with somebody that you might disagree with. And I tend to find that more and more important in my life, and I push myself to say I want to have a conversation with that individual. I want to understand why they have come up with the opinions, and maybe I can influence their opinions, and maybe they can influence mine. And things like understanding what the unemployment rates and some of the tough economic issues in rural Oregon, I think that's helpful for us to know when we go about our daily business, and try to bridge that divide a little bit. So,
Thank you.
Great. Well, the first, I think, is just monitor your input. And I think part of this is what Matt and Michael are talking about is like letting your limbic system have a break, but also recognizing that we're so susceptible to confirmation bias. Like the brain loves confirmation bias. And if you feel yourself starting to fall into that trap, to just stop and read a novel. And the other is when you start to feel yourself get outraged, like question that rising rage and ask what the source of it is. Like, when my kids get mad at each other, I often will say, do you need a piece of cheese? Just to recognize that some of it is just the human organism being overwhelmed or feeling something else. And I think the corollary for that is we're really great at a couple of public emotions, but we're really afraid of grief and sadness and uncertainty. And I think when we hear outrage in others, to really ask ourselves, what's behind that? Not just what's behind the position, but what's behind the emotion, and to be open to some of these other quieter emotions or less socially acceptable ones, and see if there's a place to connect around some of those emotions. Of course, talk to strangers at the grocery store, in line, and just see what you can hear about that. And I think that's related to the confirmation bias issue. And finally is just practice. It's hard. We're not that great at conversation anymore. Conservatives and liberals don't even like to live near each other anymore. And so to sort of practice conversations that feel uncomfortable, that sort of make you feel like running away, stay in it. And then if you're a jerk, just apologize and recognize that sometimes we're going to be a jerk. And if you don't have the presence of mind to apologize in the moment, send an email or a note, write a note, and say that and knowing that will go a long ways, and we'll do a better job the next time.